Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to have you all with us. I appreciate your patience in our delay of starting. The Amtrak has not been particularly kind to us today, so I'm stalling just a little bit so Rabbi Jonah Pesner from the Religious Action Center will be able to hear enough of our presenters' pieces so we can facilitate a panel conversation. Hearing what they have to say will definitely help him do that. And I'm hoping that by the time we get started, he will be here with all of us. I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm going to do some more formal thank yous and welcomes in just a minute, but it's our custom for our Milton and Gertrude Kleinman Consultation on Conscience, which was started about 20 years ago with Rabbi Miller and the Kleinman family, for the Kleinman family to come forward and to say a few words about their parents and what this day is all about. Unfortunately, Toby was not able to be with us today, but we have her with us through the blessings of technology, who have a few things for us this morning.
Thank you, Rabbi Baisley, honored guests, my family, friends, the consultation committee, and all of you who have joined us with us here today, both in person and online. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, as my husband does have some serious health issues, and I decided it would be best for me to watch online, so thank you for your understanding. I'd like to take you on a brief journey with me to remind each of us how appropriate it is that Anshe Emeth's biennial celebration of ethics, morality, and conscience is named after my parents, the Gertrude and Milton Kleinman Consultation on Conscience. In 2006, I looked out to see both of my parents here as I introduced the first consultation that carried their names. Today, while both of my parents are of blessed memory, it is still fitting that this carries both of their names. They were living examples of conscience. Indeed, my mother's motto was, "In matters of conscience, you do what you have to do." My parents were political and civil-minded. They raised 5 children, all of whom graduated from the religious school here at Anshe Emeth, and all of whom learned the importance of standing up for one's beliefs, despite a popular other view. Mother was a power, a woman's liber before it was popular, a woman who stood up for what she believed, who stood fearlessly for the downtrodden and performed many unpopular civic activities, including starting a nursery school for poor children in downtown New Brunswick that became one of the models for the federal Head Start program. My father was a quiet man. He had a sustainable strength that comes from harnessing the power of his convictions, a sense of right and wrong that comes from an affirmative struggle to understand what is right, and a commitment to action to try to bring about those things in which he believed. Dad was a psychologist, first for the VA after serving the Army with World War II. And while he was in the VA, he fought for veterans to have mental health care and other health benefits, long before it was a popular cause to do so. My parents openly opposed the death penalty, and Dad stood public vigil in New York the night the Rosenbergs were put to death in 1953. We are here today to provoke all of our consciences. I recall hearing about my dad standing with Paul Robeson, where a huge mob threw rocks at him. Well, he stood as a part of a human circle to let Paul Robeson sing when he was not allowed in a hall at Peekskill. Today, we bring together people of conscience. I want to mention Rabbi Philip Baisley, who as head rabbi is taking Anshe Emeth on a new ethical and socially responsible path. He's done many things here, including extending interfaith marriage, welcoming the LGBTQ community as an integral part of the community. Rabbi Baisley is inclusive, created Pride Shabbats, made gender equality as an essential part of the Anshe Emeth community, created gender-neutral bathrooms, and many other things. A man of conscience, he's normalizing normal. Along with Rabbi Baisley, I'd like to welcome the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, RAC, which was started about 60 years ago. It has been and remains the major advocacy group for Reform Judaism, for ethical, moral, and social issues. It shared strong ties with Kivi Kaplan, a Jewish businessman who was president of the NAACP from 1966 to 1975. RAC was born out of the civil rights era and has continued to do its good work to enhance civil rights. Rabbi Jonah Pesner serves as the director of RAC and has led RAC since 2015. I know, kind of as a little footnote here, that in 1964, when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was signed, and in 1965, when the Voting Act was signed, that they were partially drafted at a conference table in the RAC boardroom, and RAC assisted in the drafting. We welcome Rabbi Pesner and RAC here today, and welcome Sarah Blaine, one of the lead New Jersey organizers of RAC. We also have with us today Dr. Karen Gaffney, who will talk about systemic racism, and Reverend Charles Boyer, founding director of Salvation and Social Justice in New Jersey, and Eric Ward from Western State Center, a longtime civil rights strategist. Eric Ward is a strategic thinker, and he will guide us strategically as we think about how to move forward with social and moral justice issues, as Eric Ward's work seeks justice and equality through grassroots organizing, which will hopefully be able to transform society. Too many individuals and groups find themselves isolated and excluded from the normal discourse. They are unheard and afraid, and in our society today are actually at grave risk for just being and doing normal. My parents exemplified lives of conscience and taught their 5 children and their grandchildren to speak their minds and raise their voices and never to accept tyranny. And we were taught to fight back and to speak truth. They did this openly in the face of oppression, as when my father stood up against Joe McCarthy and left a job because he refused to take an oath, as when my mother organized opposition to the war in Vietnam and to civil rights, long before either was a popular cause. As a teenager, I was not allowed to go to a local pool where blacks were not allowed. My parents lived their conscience. This particular song exemplifies what Gertrude and Milton Kleinman worked so hard for. And Paul Robeson sang it. What is America to me? A name, a map, the flag I see, a certain word, democracy. What is America to me? The place I work in, the worker by my side, the little town or city where my people lived and died. The howdy and the handshake, the air of feeling free, and the right to speak my mind out. That's America to me. The house I live in, my neighbors, white and black, the people who just came here or from generations back, the town hall and the soapbox, the torch of liberty, a place to speak my mind out. That's America to me. The house I live in, the goodness everywhere, a land of wealth and beauty with enough for all to share. A house that we call freedom, the home of liberty, and the promise for tomorrow. That's America to me. The town I live in, the street, the house, the room, the pavement, the pavement of the city or a garden all in bloom. The church, the school, the clubhouse, million lights I see, and it's Hanukkah. But especially the people. That's America to me. But especially the people. That's the true America to me. This song was not only a favorite of my parents, but was written by Abel Meerpol, adopted father of Robert Meerpol, who was both a speaker at the Gertrude and Milton Consultation and Conscience, and was orphaned by the execution of his parents, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Pardon me. I ask each of you today to think, compare, and have a consultation on conscience regarding the country we believe in. that we are in, and as to what we all need to try to assure we maintain and improve the country my parents knew and loved. So as I welcome our speakers to the 2021 Consultation on Conscience, and has been my custom, I close this introduction with the words of a children's song sung to me by my parents, and it is apt today as it was over 50 years ago when it was banned as a part of the Red Scare of the 50s. It comes from a collection called Songs for Democracy, and it goes like this. If each little kid could have fresh milk each day, if each working man had enough time to play, if each homeless soul had a good place to stay, it would be a wonderful world. If we could consider each other a neighbor, a friend, or a brother, it would be a wonderful, wonderful world. It would be a wonderful world. If there were no poor and the rich were content, if strangers were welcome wherever they went, if each of us knew what true brotherhood meant, it would be a wonderful world. It is in support of such a vision that I express my hope, my parents' hope, that this consultation on conscience will move us closer and that it will stimulate us, we, the people, to speak up and to act on our moral obligations, to live out our individual and collective conscience. Thank you all for being here today. Welcome to all. And now I'm going to actually turn the podium over to my brother, Dr. Larry Kleinman, who is there with you in person, who will say just a few words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you all for being here, and a welcome to our esteemed speakers here and arriving soon. I also want to acknowledge my siblings, my sister Marcia, who's here, my brother John, who's not able to be, and my sister Margaret, who's a blessed memory, but has been a part of this, was a part of this from its beginning. Also, I was reading Toby's words, and it caused me to reflect on a lot of things. One of which was yesterday would have been my mom's 104th birthday, so it's a sweet and bittersweet memory. In thinking about this as a biennial celebration, it's forced me to reflect on the past 2 years. And I think about when my daughter turned 3 as the pandemic was beginning, and we called COVID the bad cold. And so my daughter would say, well, in a whole year when the bad cold is gone, and we reassure her it's not going to take a year. And that was 20-some months ago. So the wisdom of the young. We've also experienced upheaval in our society's relationship with our political system, with the very notion of facts and science. And that's caused me to reflect on some history that I read many years ago. Actually began this when I was a resident, so a very long time ago. And I'm going to start with the first 2 verses of a poem from 1738 that goes, "The glorious God hath cast abroad his anger on this nation, and dreadful wrath he kindled hath against this generation. Both young and old, O come behold the works which God hath wrought, the fearful desolation which he on this land hath brought." And the inspiration for this poem, this was written in 1738, 162 years later, in one of the first pediatric textbooks, was by Job Smith, was predicted to be the scourge of America in the future. And that cause was diphtheria, which was an acute infectious disease, mostly of childhood, but not exclusively. It was characterized by fever, sore throat, some restlessness, and could be very rapidly fatal. It was very contagious, and it was one of the first diseases we knew of that was caused by a toxin. And one of the things of diphtheria was that you might recover and then become very sick or die later of heart disease 3 or 4 weeks later. And that reminds us of some of the issues of long COVID. It was a frightening disease. The death of many children before they were arrived to years of discretion shows the woeful effects of original sin, preached one. Physicians knew that there was an increased risk for their family if they cared with children with diphtheria, and it was the first illness for which an asymptomatic carrier state was described. It led to the requirements that funerals be private, bedclothes be banned in special incinerators, quarantine was typical, and it expanded the role of the local health department such that it was the first disease for which there was mandatory testing for children with sore throats. But there was science, and it advanced us, and we were able to deal with it. And preschool vaccination in New York was the norm. In London, in contrast, only the upper school and at school age were vaccinated, the upper classes. And the London death rate from diphtheria remained stable, while that in New York plummeted and nearly disappeared. And that led a report to His Majesty's Medical Research Council by W.T. Russell to conclude, the present rates of morbidity and mortality from diphtheria in Great Britain may be held to represent a needless and extravagant waste of child life. So in a pamphlet in 1926 that was endorsed by the presidents of Harvard and Yale, we can read, diagnosis, isolation, quarantine, the detection of healthy carriers, and a more enlightened attitude on the part of the public are policy factors which combine with new technologies to enable the conquest of diphtheria. It went on, when ignorance, superstition, and prejudice prevail, preventable disease will be allowed to slay right and left, especially among children. With the practical knowledge already at our command, every case and every death therefrom is a direct challenge to our intelligence. Now, I want to suggest that it's something more than intelligence. The history of diphtheria shows that science can lead to profound advances in knowledge and technology and can change our understanding of an illness. The more effective that science is at developing interventions, the more prominent is the importance of social policy, access to services, as rate-limiting steps in improving the health of the population and of our community. And to me, this brings us all around full circle to today's consultation on conscience. In the face of various threats to our sense of normalcy and order, I believe our capacity individually and collectively to remain in contact with our humanity, our souls, and yes, our conscience, and to align our behaviors with it and with them, offers us the best help for us to lift ourselves from the profound and mundane challenges we face each day. With that, I'll turn it back to Rabbi Baisley and to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you again to the Kleinman family. I'm so happy that, Marcia, you're able to join us in person, as well as Larry and to the rest of the family that's watching online. We're thrilled that you're able to join us and that we're able to bring Toby in through Zoom. It's always nice when the technology works because you never know until you do it live. So just a few thank yous before we get started. I want to thank Anthea Cohen, the chairperson of our Tikkun Olam Task Force, along with our volunteers who have helped put this together. I'd like to point out and thank RAC New Jersey for being here, in particular Sarah Blaine, who is our lead state organizer. We've only been on the scene for 20 months or so. We launched in August during a pandemic, and in that time we've been a critical force in passing the Fair Chance in Housing Act, which was a bipartisan bill making it easier for people to get back on their feet and get housing. Right now we're working on Democracy in a Day. December 7th we're having call-ins to try and get in the lame duck season a bill passed that would enable same-day voter registration and voting. This is an incredibly important bill that really helps everybody who has the ability and right to vote. And if you'd like to know more about it, you can talk to Sarah after our consultation, but I'm hoping all of you will be part of our call-in efforts. And this goes not just for the people in the room, but the people watching online. I just saw that we have about 200 people from various sources tuning in with us as well. So as long as you're in New Jersey, please call your representatives and get this passed. I do want to acknowledge and thank Rabbi Miller for being here, our Rabbi Emeritus, who helped with the Kleinman family get this started about 20 or so years ago and has brought amazing, amazing speakers to us for this program. And I also want to acknowledge Liz Cohen here from Rack, New Jersey. I know there are many people from Rack, New Jersey here, but in particular I want to point out Liz Cohen, who helped all of this get started years and years ago with the Reformed Jewish Voices of New Jersey. And without that, Rack, New Jersey wouldn't be, so thank you, Liz. And lastly, before I turn it over to him, I want to thank Rabbi Arnie Gluck, who's been my partner with figuring this out. This is our 2020 consultation on conscience, much like the 2020 Olympics. But we were at the Religious Action Center's consultation in 2019 and heard Mr. Eric Ward speak, and he and I turned to each other and said, how do we do this in New Jersey and make it statewide? And 3 years later, we finally are able to do it. So I want to thank Rabbi Gluck from Bethel and Hillsborough for being with us and for helping be my partner in making this all come to be. So, Bavakasha, if you could come up and introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi Baisley. It really is a great honor, and our partnership in this and other things is really cherished. We are able to do a great deal more because we do it together, and that's true of all our partnerships in the state in Rack, New Jersey, so we're extremely grateful for that. And maybe we could think of this as 2020 foresight. Because we are indeed looking forward, and our speakers will help us to look forward to achieving visions of equality and justice. So I'm delighted to call first on to introduce Dr. Karen Gaffney. She is a professor of English at Raritan Valley Community College in New Jersey. Dr. Gaffney has been teaching composition and electives on race and gender there since 2003. She has a PhD in English from the University of Delaware, where she studied critical race theory and contemporary literature, which critical race theory, of course, is an accolade for us and not a derision. She wrote the prize-winning book, Dismantling the Racism Machine, a manual and toolbox which is an accessible and interdisciplinary introduction to race and racism with tools for action. For several years, Dr. Gaffney has facilitated or co-facilitated anti-racism workshops at libraries and churches and for various organizations. She was selected as a public scholar by the New Jersey Council of the Humanities. She has presented her work at national conferences, including Netroots Nation, the White Privilege Conference, the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in American Higher Education, the Association for Ethnic Studies, the American Studies Association, the Modern Language Association, critical race theory conferences at both Yale Law School and UCLA Law School, and the Working Class Studies Association. Dr. Gaffney, thank you for gracing us with your presence, and we look forward to hearing your teaching.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so appreciative of the invitation. So you should be able to see a slide with some photos of recent protest signs, is that right? Okay, great. So, how did we get here? The new symbol of tyranny, don't mask my freedom, my body, my choice, no mandatory vaccine, critical race theory equals lies, 1776 equals truth, critical race theory is racist, no masks, I can't breathe. So many fundamental narratives about justice have been flipped. Rather than masks being for public health and the public good in a global pandemic, white people in particular protest that masking is a sign of tyranny and oppression, even evoking Eric Gardner's last words, "I can't breathe," as he was killed by the police. Rather than critical race theory serving as a valuable method of understanding the persistence of systemic racism, white people in particular protest that critical race theory is the thing that is racist, that talking about race is racist. Rather than oppression tyranny, and racism being the language used to describe actual oppression, tyranny, and racism, many white people use that language to describe things that simply make them feel uncomfortable. And white people's comfort has been protected for centuries, back to the very origin of whiteness, its very invention. One of the biggest problems is that white people have not been taught that whiteness is an invention. Instead, white people have been taught that whiteness is real, even biologically real, that it is special, innocent, good, and superior. We need to get at the root of these false racial myths and show how whiteness is an invention, a fiction, a lie, created for the purposes of power and control of the masses, to maintain the status quo of the elite. Recognizing that racism is systemic allows us to get to the core of these myths. However, focusing on racism as an individual act perpetrated by a few bad apples ignores the many ways in which all of our systems, from the criminal justice system to education to real estate to the media, have been disproportionately negatively impacting Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American communities. I grew up in predominantly white, central suburban New Jersey in the 1970s and 80s. It was segregated. This should not be a surprise because New Jersey is one of the most racially segregated states, with one of the most racially segregated school systems, with one of the worst racial wealth gaps in the country. While I took that segregation for granted as the norm, in school I learned nothing about the systems that created it and perpetuated it. I did not learn that segregation was by design. Instead, I learned that as a white girl, I was good. I was innocent. I learned the criminal justice system was fair, that the founding fathers and European so-called explorers were our heroes and should be celebrated. I learned that the US was good, was exceptional, just like me. I didn't learn this from the KKK. I learned this from well-meaning white people. Today, white people protest that talking about race makes them and their white children feel guilty. If anything, refusing to talk about race and our country's history of racism is the problem. As a white person, I believe that my fellow white people and I need to acknowledge what we've been indoctrinated into, and we need to acknowledge that becoming unindoctrinated can be liberating. It was critical race theory, which I first started reading more than 20 years ago in grad school, that helped me understand this, especially the need to analyze the persistence of racism as systemic. That's why I called my book Dismantling the Racism Machine. Racism is made by humans. It is not a natural phenomenon, and it is a powerful machine that has been recalibrated over and over again to suit the needs of the elite at any given moment. We are living in a decades-long backlash to the civil rights movement, and the racism machine has been fortified by white fear that white people will soon be a statistical minority. During my presentation today, I will highlight 3 false racial myths that white people in particular have been indoctrinated into. I believe these myths need to be debunked in order to dismantle the racism machine, work toward racial justice, and use our radical imagination to build the world we want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gaffney. It's my great joy and privilege to introduce now my friend, Reverend Dr. Charles Boyer. Reverend Dr. Charles Franklin Boyer is a third-generation African-American Episcopal preacher. He is the pastor of Greater Mount Zion AME Church in Trenton, New Jersey, and the co-founder with his wife, Rosalie, who's here with us in the front row, of Salvation and Social Justice, a nonpartisan Black faith-rooted organization that believes liberation should precede legislation and prophetic vision should precede public policy. Dr. Boyer is a leading faith voice in New Jersey for racial justice issues, the campaign to abolish the drug war, and the criminalization of Black people. His advocacy has led to the statewide adoption of racial impact analysis for sentencing, closure of youth prisons, voting rights restoration for people on probation and parole, the independent prosecutor law, and restricting solitary confinement. He has been recognized as one of New Jersey's 25 most influential African Americans by the South Jersey Journal, a game changer by the NAACP, a torchbearer by the ACLU, a movement maker by New Jersey Working Families, and a community servant by New Jersey Citizen Action. He's been recognized by the New Jersey Work Environment Council and received the Making Democracy Work Award by the League of Women Voters. It is my great pleasure and honor to present to you Charles Boyer.
Thank you to Rabbi Gluck, Rabbi Beasley, good friends. You know, when I was looking at the format, I say it's dangerous to give a Black preacher 2 times to speak. So, knowing that this is a privilege, I'll keep the intro very short. Today, when we go deeper into the discussion, I'm going to really get into the specifics of the organization that Rosalie and I founded and why. This Salvation and Social Justice. But to give you an understanding of why that. I was talking to some folks in my office prior to leaving Trenton today. And I shared with them my experience as a young man. I grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s here in New Jersey as well. I appreciate Dr. Gaffney's analysis is spot on. And for us, we first tried to deal with how racism and hatred has been justified and nurtured theologically. I grew up here in New Jersey. I grew up in Plainfield, New Jersey. And when I grew up in Plainfield, New Jersey, it was mostly all Black people. And when I was headed towards high school, my parents, Dr. Gaffney laid it out correctly, New Jersey being one of the most segregated states in the nation. Plainfield High School was one of the worst high schools at the time. My parents didn't want me to go to that high school. The first bite at the apple for my education, they sent me to Timothy Christian School in Piscataway. And it was there that I learned 2 things. It's the first time I realized I was Black. I mean, I knew I was Black, But it wasn't until I got into a mostly white religious environment that I felt the gravity of what black really meant. I was taught that the color of my skin was a curse, that God had cursed us, that our ancestors being slaves was ordained by God, and that we were destined to servitude. It was the gravity of that theology that set the rest of my life on a path to understand the depths of what I see as white terroristic theology. Any theology that would demonize a people. And it was this point in my life that I began to reject the religion of my father and my mother and my grandfather and all those who came before me. Because I said that if that religion destined me to servitude and oppression, then that religion was not for me. And it wasn't until I got older, until I understood history and theology for myself, that I began to realize that everybody doesn't read the book the same way. And some folks use God as a weapon, and other folks use God for what God is, a liberator and a healer. And it is through that prism which I began to see the world in a different way. And also, as I got older, I began to see that I was black a long time before I ever got to Timothy Christian. The fact that I lived in poverty, but didn't even realize that that was because I was black. The fact that my parents had to try to ship me to a private school but couldn't afford it, and then illegally sent me to Piscataway High School, was because I was black. The reasons we struggled, whether we were going to eat or not, was because I was black. The reasons we sat a year at a time with no electricity in our house was because I was black. It wasn't because I had some broken home, some single mother, personal responsibility. My family was fully intact. All of the personal responsibility things. My father worked, my mother worked, but they were working poor. And my father was a Vietnam veteran. And when he got home from Vietnam, he was still a nigger. And it is from that framework, this theological framework, that brings us to this moment today, and what I would like to share later, of why we do what we do from a theological lens first, and why that is so critically important. Thank you so much.
Like I said earlier, is our next speaker who caught our attention and thought of opening this up to the entire state. We're going to hear from him, and then we're going to go back around through all of our speakers and have them explore their topics with greater depth in just a moment. But it's a pleasure to welcome Eric Ward, a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate, violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. He is the recipient of the 2021 Civic Courage Prize from the Train Foundation. I believe it's the first time an American has won this one. It's the first time an American has won this award in its 21-year history. In his 30-plus years of civil rights, Eric has worked with community groups, government and business leaders, human rights advocates, and philanthropies as an organizer, director, program officer, consultant, and board member. Eric is widely quoted. His writings and his speeches are credited with key narrative shifts in society. He is the current executive director of Western State Center, a senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward, and co-chair of the Proteus Fund. And it is an honor to invite you up in our sanctuary.
Hello, everyone. And all those on live stream, too. I thought I would start off with a number of statistics and data about the rise of bigotry, the rise of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. But I decided not to do that. One is, I grew up Baptist. Once I start quoting statistics and facts, we could be up here 4 hours. But the other reason is that I realized that those statistics can't convince you. If you don't realize with your own eyes what you have seen over the last 4 years, there is not one piece of data or fact on this stage that is going to convince you otherwise. We are a country in crisis. We are a country that understands that the insurrection that we all witnessed on January 6th did not end on January 6th. It's taking place in towns and communities across this country. The victims, students, educators, healthcare workers, law enforcement, and local government officials who each day rise to go to work or school and are faced by those seeking to intimidate and bully them. For 30 years, I've organized with communities nationally and at the local level to respond to this rise of hate group violence. It didn't begin on January 6th. It began, as we will unpack, soon after the passage of some of the great civil rights acts in this country. For you see, we are not dealing with a white revolution. We are dealing with a white backlash against the victory of the civil rights movement. Has white supremacy, that system of racism, is grounded upon anti-blackness? This white nationalist movement is grounded upon anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is at the core of white nationalism. It isn't merely part of the core. I want to repeat this as a non-Jew who is African American, who has organized against the white nationalist movement for over 30 years. It is the core of white nationalism. Anti-Semitism is so central to white nationalism that I and other marginalized groups, I as an African American, understand we will never win equity in this country if we are not also active in the struggle to uproot this form of anti-Jewish hate. Amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same role they have always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils, and the driving force behind white dispossession. At the foundation of this modern-day movement is the explicit claim that Jews are a separate race. Their position as white in the society is portrayed as the greatest trick that the devil has ever played. For you see, for white nationalists and other anti-Semites, Jews, despite and indeed because of the fact that they are seen as white, are an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. We saw this on the march in Charlottesville, Virginia, the Unite the Right rally. I watched the news that evening. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all scratched their heads and said, why are they chanting Jews would not replace us? For you see, Anti-Semitism is so unconscious and unacknowledged in American society that even news anchors couldn't conceive that the chant was Jews will not replace us. It is this fantasy of invisible Jewish power that explains for white nationalists and others how Black Americans, a race of supposed inferiors, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, how feminists in the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, and how even immigrants could mount successful challenges to economic inequality. Folks ask me, where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? It's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. It is such rabid anti-Semitism that is the framework upon which the entire movement functions. For those of us who are not white nationalists, for those of us who stand in the face of bigotry, we should understand that to refuse to deal with any ideology of domination is to abet it. Fighting anti-Semitism cuts off the animating force of white nationalism for the sake of all marginalized communities. But I want to leave you with a few catches. The first is, we must understand that anti-Semitism, or white nationalists, don't bring anti-Semitism to our communities. They merely organize the anti-Semitism that exists. The white nationalist movement isn't promoting anti-Semitism merely to promote anti-Semitism. They're tapping into anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry in order to build political power. If you are concerned, like I am, about the white nationalist movement, there's another truth that you must hold, and it is this: that if we truly want to defeat white nationalism and pick up once again the march towards inclusive democracy that is people-centered, transparent, and accountable, we have to be brave enough to pick up the mirror and take a deep look into it. At the end of the day, the white nationalist movement is not winning because it is smarter or better organized. It is not winning because democracy is weak. It is winning because we refuse to deal with the contradictions of race in our society. And our refusal to embrace those contradictions and solve them leave us vulnerable to white nationalist and political violence. But there's a third piece here. And the third piece is this: we have to stop pretending that we are observers in the struggle for American democracy. We have to stop treating it as a curiosity, a 30-minute sitcom, or an interesting movie. You see, the struggle for democracy is about our lives and the lives of our children. But more importantly, it's about the lives of 75 years of civil rights struggle. Those who fought and died, were injured and maimed because they believed in the idea of a country where all people could live together, love together, work together, and worship together. That bill has now come due, but we can't pay that bill unless we stand together. We stand for equity, we stand against political violence, and we take serious the work of democracy. That's the work ahead of us. Welcome to the 21st century civil rights movement.
I hope that little taste from each of our speakers has whet your appetite for what's next to come. I'm going to invite up Dr. Gaffney again to share a little bit more.
Great, thank you again. I just want to say again, I'm so appreciative for the opportunity to be here and for the amazing work of my fellow speakers here. So my approach, as I started to allude to earlier, has two aspects. One is developing an anti-racist mindset, which I'll focus on now, and then applying an anti-racist mindset, which I'll get to when we wrap up. The first focuses on one's interior work, especially for white people, unlearning the false racial myths we were often taught. And when I say taught, I mean consciously and unconsciously through education, the media, family, and more. False racial myths are everywhere. If we are born in the United States, we breathe those false racial myths in since birth. So if we are passive, and even if we say we're not racist, we're still not questioning those myths. But if we become aware of them and recognize their damage, we can work on unlearning those myths. We can work on becoming unindoctrinated and have a new anti-racist perspective that is active and not passive. Unlearning these false racial myths is a never-ending, lifelong journey. So what are some of the false racial myths we need to unlearn? I'll highlight 3 of them for you right now. So you should see a slide that identifies the first myth that I want to focus on. The myth that human races are biologically different. We might think that 2 random white people are closer biologically to each other than a random white person and black person. But that is just simply not true. That belief is false. The reality is that there are no inherent or biological or genetic differences between groups we call races, because race is a social construct, a human invention. Human DNA is about 99.9% identical throughout the world. Human beings are one of the most genetically similar of all species. Dorothy Roberts is one of the many brilliant scholars and writers who discusses this. I especially like the language of her book title, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. Those words, invention, fatal, recreate, are especially important and highlight how this construction is by design. If you aren't familiar with her work, please check it out. In addition to her book, she has a great TED Talk. My website, dividednolonger.com, includes a link to her work as well as many other resources that help debunk the myth that race is biological. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because this myth is dangerous. It's dangerous because it serves as a rationale and justification for white supremacy, anti-blackness, imperialism, colonialism, genocide, land theft, slavery, segregation, immigration restrictions, and so much more. The myth that race is biological determines who is considered civilized, who is considered human, fully human. These beliefs are seen as natural, inherent, unchangeable, as biological. This dangerous belief manifests itself in every system we have today, whether through arrest and incarceration rates that disproportionately impact Black people and Latinx people, or through the way that Black people's pain is taken less seriously than white people's pain in the healthcare industry, or through the school to prison pipeline, or through the lack of diverse representation in the media and popular culture. If we chip away at the false and dangerous myth that race is biological and recognize the reality that race is a human invention, then what I call the racism machine is more visible. And that leads to our second myth. This is the myth that race has always existed, that whiteness has always existed. We have been taught to think that people have always thought of each other in terms of race, that people have always assigned value to skin color. But that is a false belief. That is a myth. The reality is that race is a relatively recent human invention. One location where we can look to see this is in the early days of colonial Virginia in the 1600s. During these early days, the line between servant and enslaved person was ambiguous. People didn't identify as black or white. They identified by nationality, language, religion. Skin color was not the primary dividing line. The main dividing line was between the elite, wealthy landowners and the labor, the people working the land. In 1676, Bacon's Rebellion occurred in Virginia, a rebellion by people we would call white and people we would call black against the landowning elite. This rebellion, this example of what we would call multiracial solidarity, terrified the colonial elite because it threatened their power and status. One result was the invention of racial categories and a racial hierarchy. And we can see an example of this in the 1705 law called the Slave Codes, passed in colonial Virginia. Part of this law said that the right to vote, serve on a jury, hold office were taken away from black people with property who were now deemed, quote, persons incapable in law. Another part of the law said that enslaved black and Native American people are now, quote, real estate, meaning chattel, property that could be inherited. And slavery is now a permanent status. Another part of the law said that European servants, newly called white, they had to be taught they were white, now receive benefits of food, money, and a weapon when they finish their servitude, which is temporary and can go to court if not treated well. Race was invented to protect the elite and divide and conquer the masses through the creation of a racial hierarchy. Divide and conquer. Divide because one large group is divided by new racial categories, and conquer because those categories are positioned on a hierarchy with white at the top. Legal scholar Michelle Alexander calls whiteness a, quote, racial bribe, in which European laborers were bribed with the new idea of whiteness to turn against enslaved black people. So myth number one, that race is biological, and myth number two, that race and whiteness have always existed, were built into the founding of this country and fully established in the 1800s. We're going to jump ahead to the mid to late 1800s to the ideology of manifest destiny represented by this painting. What do you see? Consider the right side of the painting to be what is now the eastern United States, and the left side to be what is now the western United States. Do you see the bright sunny light on the right side? The side already supposedly benefiting from colonization and then the formation of the United States as a nation. The white woman is moving westward, bringing light into land that looks darker and foreboding because of the presence of indigenous people. Manifest Destiny was the ideology of white supremacy that focused on white settlers deserving to live on the land that became the United States more than the land's original inhabitants. The myth was that white people deserve this land because they are inherently, biologically, the most civilized, the most human, the most deserving. Think about how that centuries-old ideology is alive and well today. This map of native land is not the map we usually see when we see representations of what is now the United States. American history often makes this map invisible. I certainly did not see this map when I was growing up. Instead, this is the map I grew up with that was ever present in classrooms from kindergarten to high school, yet the land was never called stolen. Instead, I took this map and its 50 states for granted as normal, as the way it is supposed to be. To connect these ideas together, if we don't recognize that race is constructed, then we normalize or take for granted whiteness as the default and the ideology that white people are superior. We take for granted a racial hierarchy based on anti-blackness. If we don't recognize that race is constructed, we think race and whiteness have always existed, and we see race as natural, as biological. And past and present systemic racism are invisible. So that brings me to the third and last false racial myth. This is the myth that the civil rights movement ended racism. We might hear that systemic racism is no longer a problem, or that slavery is over, or we had a black president, so how can there be racism anymore? The reality, of course, is that systemic racism is a serious problem in the US today, and it manifests itself through every system we have. For example, the persistence of housing segregation and school segregation, which relates to unequal access to resources. Our high Black maternal and infant mortality rates. The lack of diverse representation in media and popular culture, and racially disproportionate surveillance, arrests, and incarceration. And finally, the racial wealth gap, which brings me back to New Jersey. The New Jersey Institute for Social Justice has done amazing research about how New Jersey has one of the worst racial wealth gaps in the entire country. As they say, the US has a racial wealth gap problem. New Jersey has a disaster. It relates directly to who can live in which neighborhood, which connects to redlining and its legacy, as well as who has the financial resources for which neighborhood, and which neighborhoods have had resources and infrastructure added, and which neighborhoods have had them stripped away. This relates directly to intergenerational wealth, and whose grandparents, for example, had access to government-subsidized opportunities like post-World War II low-interest loans and college education, and whose didn't. It also relates to the legacy of slavery. Growing up in New Jersey, in the rare times that slavery was discussed in my school, it was something that happened elsewhere, far away, in the South. We were the good guys in the North. I didn't learn until college that slavery had even occurred in New Jersey. And not only that, but that New Jersey was the last state in the North to have slavery. To end slavery, I mean. So again, New Jersey was the last state in the North to end slavery. Most of my college students, most of whom also were recent high school graduates, have not been exposed to this history either. The work of New Jersey's Amistad Commission and Amistad Law needs more support. In New Jersey, if white people in particular think of racism as something that happens someplace else, then racism will never end. I believe here in New Jersey, white people in particular need to recognize how we've been indoctrinated into false racial myths and work on unindoctrinating ourselves in order to develop an anti-racist mindset. Then we need to apply that anti-racist mindset and consider action, which we'll get to fairly soon, I think. Thank you so much, everybody.
I know we are throwing a lot of information at people, some really good information that people want to process. We're going to keep our speakers coming, and then we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to have more of a dialogue and a conversation so that we can unpack some of the things that we are taking in. Reverend Boyer.
You know, again, I thank Eric Ward and Dr. Gaffney. They're making my job very easy. They are really hitting all the right notes. I just want to lift up, because I'd like to dovetail a little bit on both pieces, because it really speaks to the point. Brother Ward discussed about the center of anti-Semitism. And I would argue that this hatred towards Jews is for a reason. And the reason is the power of the religion, the theology. And I say that so powerful because it is that story, it is that religion that gives birth to the black church, has subjugated people. And when we're being told that we're less than, that we're divinely set, that God has rejected us, when we were denied the ability to read, we were given a version of the Bible. It's called the Slave Bible. And they took out all of the passages about Moses. They took out all of the passages from the prophets, from Isaiah and Ezekiel, Daniel and Habakkuk. They took all of that out. They took out most of what Jesus said. They left in the Apostle Paul and a few others and told us, slaves, obey your masters. But when we began to be able to preach and hear the story ourselves, we gravitated to the story that binds us all. And it is from that point. You know, just to make the point, and so I can stay on time, you know, they call Harriet Tubman Black Moses for a reason. The church, the black church, births because it sees that God actually cares about the forgotten, the oppressed, and the slave. That God is on the side of those who are rejected. And it is there that the black church emerges. And I would argue as the greatest liberating force for black people in the United States. And it's when I realized that in my formation that I begin to no longer reject the religion because now I understand it correctly. And that's where we come in this discussion. As Dr. Gaffney pointed out, all of these lies that are perpetuated, they're undergirded by this theology, and the Black church emerges in response to it all. The church that I pastor, Greater Mount Zion in Trenton, is the oldest Black church in Trenton, and it was organized in the 1700s as part of the Underground Railroad, organized towards the freedom of Black people, organized so Black people could be educated. And this is the story of many of the Black churches. It was the only place where Black people could be human beings, where we were taught that we were divine images of God just like anybody else. This is why the power of the civil rights movement, and even prior, when you think about the great abolitionists in the United States, you think about Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and all of the rest, and they were all connected theologically. And they were all connected to many and amongst the same prophets that we would all subscribe to. And that's why looking at this from a theological lens is so critical. And I love the point because it is very true that we figured that at the point of the I Have a Dream speech and the signing of the Civil Rights Bill, that everything was all right. And it was certainly done once Barack Obama became president. But we saw ultimately that nothing had really changed that drastically. And so we look at this work critically to examine it from a theological lens. How do we still theologically dismantle structural racism and at the same time empower Black people through the history, the theology, and the work historically of the Black church to realize liberation in the current day? And our theory of change is rooted in a couple of people. We say we move from lament to liberation. And that's very familiar language to all of us here. For folks who have been oppressed by the very systems that Dr. Gaffney laid out, it's critical that we pull those folks in a room. Folks who've been incarcerated, Black women who nearly have lost their lives, or lost their child, given birth, people living in poverty, people who do not have proper health care, folks who have suffered from the inadequacies in the education system. And it's critical that we ask a question different than what a punitive, structurally racist system asks. Because a structurally racist system doesn't ask anything. It punishes. And it makes a commodity out of Black bodies. That's what it has always done. That's why New Jersey's prisons are the most racially unjust in the nation. You're 12 times more likely to be incarcerated in New Jersey than a white person, which is by far the worst in the nation. The national average, which is egregious, is 6 times. So along with the racial wealth gap comes the unjust incarceration rate. Instead of asking where you at so we could pick you up and imprison you, the question is, what happened? What do you wish would have happened instead of? And so hearing the lament, hearing where people are coming from, and allowing those who have been hurt the worst by the system. In the Black church, we call the moment, we call it giving your testimony. By giving witness to what you've been through and imagining where you would want to be. Moving from lament, understanding what happened, to then prophetic outcry. During the summer of George Floyd, you saw prophetic outcry in the streets. When people have no way, when they've been diminished at the ballot box, when they've been diminished economically and educationally, when they don't know how to express themselves any other way but to react to the pain, the anger, and the trauma which we have witnessed time and time again on video to our family members, whatever it is, it disperses as a prophetic outcry. But within our theory of change, we try to see, what does that prophetic outcry look like? How do we organize with that? Community as a witness. When it came to trying to, during the COVID moment, New Jersey had the deadliest prisons in the nation. Our organization was getting phone calls 4 or 5 times a day. People who had contracted COVID, people who were dying. 83 people died. And we were hearing people's hurt, their pain, and prophetic outcry turned into a black church funeral procession, where nearly 500 cars showed up at the War Memorial in Trenton. And we had a black church funeral. We preached and sung songs, because then you couldn't even have any funeral in person, if you remember. And then the folks drove around the War Memorial where the governor was giving his report. And we demanded, let our people go. It was through that work, through the prophetic outcry, ultimately 5,000 people were released from prison, folks who were ending their sentences nearly anyway within a year. And thousands of lives were likely saved as a result. And so, moving people from prophetic outcry to become rituals of resistance, and that is where we begin to realize the change, the liberation. And folks can become advocates themselves once they have taken the scars in their wounds and now become places of healing and people of healing for other people. In New Jersey, there's multiple systems that we're dealing with. Right now, we're dealing with the drug war here in New Jersey. New Jersey still incarcerates outrageous numbers of people who are dealing with health issues. Police and prisons are still our primary response. And we don't send the police to incarcerate people who are ailing with cancer or diabetes. Black women are still dying at astronomical rates in childbirth, regardless of economic status. New Jersey's police are still using force at extremely high rates. Our education system is still the most segregated, and we unconstitutionally operate our schools by not allowing children to go to different schools because of what zip code they live in. And so the work we must do, sisters and brothers, is to allow ourselves to make sacred space for those most impacted by the structural violence, in order that they can determine and be the leaders for their own liberation. Thank you very much.
feel like we need to send you to a break right after that. You know, I've told this story before, but back in 2017 in Portland, Oregon, it was the summer of 2017. It was after a wave of political violence. People may have seen Portland, Oregon on the news since then, but it started before you saw it. And it started in 2017 when alt-right activists, Proud Boys and others, began protesting on the streets of Portland and being confronted by counter-protesters. It escalated one night on a light rail train when a white nationalist threatened two young black women, one who was Muslim. Three white men who didn't know each other, who happened to be on the train, two on their way home from work, intervened. That's the first miracle, though. Anyone who understands crime understands that strangers rarely intervene. The second is that they inserted themselves physically between this white nationalist and these two young women who were riding the light rail. The white nationalist was so angry that he couldn't get to these two young women that he pulled out a knife and he slashed the throats of all three of these men, two who died right there that night on the light rail. We were outraged, and the nation was outraged with us. But the real thing we should have been outraged with was the event that took place the night before, when that same white nationalist on a light rail did the same thing to another African-American woman on her way from work. The difference was that she happened to have a mace with her, and she sprayed him with the mace. He hit her in the head with a bottle. The police came and put them both in handcuffs, both of them. They let him go that night, and the rest is history. I think about that because in that summer of 2017, there was a protest by the alt-right outside of a blues festival in Portland, Oregon. Why did they pick the blues festival? Well, because they're organizers, and they understood there'd be a lot of people going in and out of the festival. They planned their protest right around 3:30 p.m. Why? Because they knew that the media would come and it would make the evening news. That those of us sitting at home would see the play unfold. The confrontation between the alt-right and counter-protesters. The intervention by law enforcement. The tear gas. The physical fights. That we would all be appalled. And it would give us a story that our country was falling apart. That we were no longer in control of our destinies. While all this was unfolding, I saw a scenario that bears repeating. It was a young alt-right activist, and he was sitting over on the side, kind of catching his breath and doing what we all do with our phones these days, tapping on it. And all of a sudden, you may have seen this person before. I don't know his name, but he exists in every community. He had the camera, and he came running up to the alt-right activist, shouting at him, demanding that this alt-right activist explain what he was doing in Portland, Oregon. Did he not know that the mayor of Portland, Oregon didn't want him there? Didn't he know that counter-protesters didn't want him there in Portland, Oregon? Did he not know that the entire community of Portland rejected his racism and bigotry? Why was he there? The guy with the camera asked. The alt-right activist looked up at him and he said, "Well, I've heard we're not wanted in Portland. But did you know Portland, Oregon has a shrinking black population? by both percentage and whole number. He then said to the guy with the camera, so you can say you don't want us here, but you're actually doing something we could never get away with. You're disappearing the black people of Portland, Oregon. In short, he was calling us hypocrites. He understood that at the end of the day, the unchecked racism and segregation of American society is killing us all. It makes us look like hypocrites. And in an age where everything is changing, because let's be clear, it's quite an honor and also quite horrifying to watch the end of one age and the beginning of another. It happens about every generation, but it happens. And we happen to be those people who are watching this transformation. It doesn't go easy. But the white nationalist movement has understood for a long time that this moment was coming. Back in 1999, it might be for some of those who are watching who are younger, that may sound like ancient history. When I just said 1999 out loud, it sounded like ancient history to me too. But back in 1999, I was working for an organization in the Pacific Northwest called the Northwest Coalition, founded by former Catholic priest, Father Bill Wasmuth, who had his home bombed by the Aryan nations as he was organizing in rural parts of Idaho against hate crimes and hate violence. Well, it's 1999, and there was this thing called Y2K, and there were armed paramilitaries running around the country. Oklahoma City, right, had happened. It was quite a terrible time in this country. There was a group running around the country who called themselves Christian Identity. They taught that Jews were the literal children of Satan, people of color were subhuman, and that white Northern Europeans were the true descendants of the tribes of Israel, and that the United States was their new coming together, and that they had to rid people of color and Jews from this country in order to orchestrate and build their white-only ethno-state. This was the early 90s. But Y2K was the big sensation. I don't know if folks remember Y2K. Y2K was supposed to be this period where the calendars that had been built into computer chips weren't going to be able to calculate the new year. And we're going to flip back to the 1900s. And if you remember the stories at the time, right, there was going to be financial collapse. Planes would drop out of the air. Our phones and computers wouldn't work. We wouldn't be able to get money out of the banks. People were storing food in preparation for this natural disaster. I remember a reporter calling me, asking, tell us, Eric, what is the white nationalist movement? What are these armed paramilitary groups planning for Y2K? Well, I said, they're probably doing, I thought it was smart then. I was still a hardcore punk rocker, and I wanted to have the best quote. So I said, they're probably going to be doing what I'm going to be doing on December 31st, 1999. They're going to be popping popcorn and watching Lawrence Welk. I said because the white nationalist movement isn't talking about Y2K. They're making a lot of money off of Y2K, but they're not talking about 2000. I said they're talking about 2032, 2050, and all of their publications. The reporter asked me, why are they talking about those years? And I said, because the U.S. Census Bureau says it's sometime in between that period where they say whites will no longer be the majority. Now, the white nationalist movement reframes that. What they say is that whites will be the minority. Now, that's not true. And I could unpack that today, but let me be very quick. For whites to be the minority, assumes that somehow in 2050, January 1st, that communities of color from around the United States are going to all of a sudden get along and have a key plan that doesn't include white America, right? The second is, as I said, it would mean a transformative perspective within the Latino community, where large segments of the Latino community no longer see themselves as white. Not unlikely to happen. He said the truth of the matter is that come 2050, the white population in the United States is largely to be percentually larger than it is when I was speaking in 1999. That's just because of how the Latino population self-identifies. But you see, it became a very good organizing hook for the white nationalist movement. During that period, both Newsweek and Times did front-page articles called The Browning of America, right? Many of us in the racial justice movement talk about this moment, right, as if it will be this transformative moment. For the white nationalist movement, even back then, 2032 and 2050 was that period that they focused on. This is what we can take away from that young white nationalist activist in Portland, Oregon, outside that blues festival. The first is this, that we must begin to figure out in our communities how to contend with demographic anxiety. Demographic anxiety is the fear one feels when they walk into a room and don't know anyone. Raise your hand if you've ever walked into a room and you didn't know anyone in the room in your lifetime. That ever happened to you? Yeah, most of us. So here's the good thing. Most of us have actually experienced demographic anxiety. That feeling of walking into a space not knowing anyone, you know that anxiety you feel self-conscious, everyone knows you, you feel kind of lonely, you feel like, should I be here, should I not be here? Well, that's what we are experiencing right now in the United States, that same demographic anxiety. How do we overcome that anxiety? You keep entering the space. It's just like those of us who have a fear of flying. You probably wouldn't know. Eric Ward has a fear of flying. I don't talk about it much. But yet, Eric Ward flies thousands of miles every year, tens of thousands of miles. How did he overcome his fear of flying? Well, Eric Ward just kept flying because that's what all the experts said. If you want to learn how to manage your anxiety, you keep leaning in. This is what we need to do around demographic anxiety now. We have white nationalists on one hand telling us that that anxiety is an existential threat and that we must prepare for battle, race war, civil war, insurrection in order to come to terms with that anxiety. Can't deal much with the white nationalist movement. But we make our own stumbles on our own side as well. And this is where we pick up the mirror. We are constantly telling people who have anxiety that they are racist or bigoted. That is also not helpful in this moment. Yes, that anxiety expresses itself through racialized systems because we live in a system of white supremacy, a system that has taught each of us that there is this false parameter of race. As we've learned from Dr. Gaffney, race is a social construct. It is not a biological one. Race doesn't exist, but racism does. And it conditions each of us. So our demographic anxiety in the time of great change formalizes and articulates itself in racialized terms. But the people are merely expressing anxiety. I remember once being out in eastern Oregon, in a place called Ontario, Oregon, that has poverty levels, right, on par with what we deal with in black communities in Portland. because despite the TV show, Portland, Oregon is not Portlandia. In fact, we call it Northwest Mississippi. In terms of economy, education, one of the most disparate police brutality based off race, African Americans 4 times more likely to be killed than their white neighbors in Portland, Oregon. But we understand that at the end of the day, as we went down to Ontario, we're going to meet with white farmers and hear their stories. And so we get down there. And what we find out is many of these white farmers, 10, 15, 20 years ago, had been millionaires. They put their kids through school in terms of their land. Economic inequality visited them as well. The plague. Soon they found themselves working 2 or 3 jobs just to hold on to what property they could. Their kids leaving the communities and not returning because there was no future there. Social service agencies coming in to fill the gaps. And demographic change. As these farmers were telling their stories about all that they lost, one of my colleagues said to one of the farmers, "Now you know what it's like, right? Now you know what it's like, what black communities face each and every day." That wasn't the helpful response. I quickly said, because I wanted to have a larger conversation, that I'm sorry that that is happening to you. And I shared what had happened to my father and to my family in the 1970s. And I said, that should never happen to any of us. Here is the first lesson. In dealing with demographic anxiety, we can't have those conversations. We can't lift up, right, the similarities of issues we might face if we are not actually in the same rooms together. So here's the courageous piece. In addressing demographic anxiety, we have to build movements that are courageous enough to stand in the same rooms together, that embrace complexity, nuance, and uncomfortability. As I have said over the last 4 years, we cannot fight racism without sadly experiencing racism. We cannot fight anti-Semitism without experiencing anti-Semitism. It is unfair, but it is the burden for those of us who care about a future America, for our children, and for those of us who feel we owe a debt to those who came before us. But there are other things we have to do that come from this lesson. We have to deal with the real systemic inequalities in our society, the things that prevent us from leaning in around demographic anxiety. Segregation of schools, segregation of housing, segregation of education, segregation of culture. These are the things that reinforce and make the white nationalist work in this country easy. And these are the things that we allow to continue each and every day. It is our burden every time a white nationalist beats or harms or kills someone, because we have created the conditions that signal to them that we are on their side. Segregation cannot stand. Segregation, along with anti-Semitism, fuels and drives white nationalist violence in our society. We have to take desegregation seriously. Third, we have rough waters ahead. Rabbi Jonah Pesner hears me talk probably far too often. He knows I'm an optimist. But I'm also very clear about the moment we are in. And while we may not want to articulate it, all of us understand the moment we are in. We watched 140 law enforcement officers injured on the steps of the Capitol building in our nation's capital on January 6th. 140 injured. Imagine what other protest in this country where 140 law enforcement officers were physically injured. We know what moment we are in. This moment calls for resistance, but it is not a physical resistance. One cannot destroy the master's house using the master's tools, said Audre Lorde in her essay. Violence will not dominate the white nationalist movement. At its core is violence. It breathes violence. It feeds off of violence. What defeats white nationalism is courageous kindness. It may not sound strong because we live in an era of authoritarianism that says that anything that doesn't sound like might is right sounds weak. But courageous kindness, the practice of how we take care of one another, will be the essential tool that will ensure our society makes it out of this moment. How do we practice courageous kindness each and every day? Well, we should be doing the big things, making sure that our elected officials understand that everyone should have access to food, health, and housing. What type of society can we be when we don't house, feed, and clothe our neighbors? But we won't get there just by demanding the biggest leaps. We get there by practicing daily. I learned once, talking about the Holocaust with experts, about resistance and bystanders, perpetrators. And of course, I focused, if you know me, you know the first question was, tell me about the resistors. How did they work up the courage to resist? They must have been super brave. And the information I got back was, no. Actually, resistors were quite complicated. And then I was told about Oskar Schindler, who I didn't know started off, right, trying to exploit the Jewish community. Ended up becoming one of the greatest rescuers. So I asked, how did Oskar Schindler move from here to here? Well, he began to embrace courageous kindness, and he didn't even know he was doing it. But he kept doing one small thing that just built on it, and eventually it became a habit. And became such a habit that he began to scale it up, saving hundreds of lives, generations that are still among us because of him. We each have this opportunity to practice courageous kindness, but we have to start now, today. The third is this. If you understand demographic anxiety, if you understand that the contradictions of segregation have helped get us here and keep us here in this moment, and that practicing courageous kindness helps us move out of this moment. The third is this. Know who you are and know what moment you stand in. When I was a kid, I used to play this game called If I Were. We grew up super poor. We grew up, my sister and I, in a one-room motel room from 7th grade through graduating through high school. I've worked since I was 12. But here's one of the things that would happen every summer. By August, right, we were out of resources. By August, right, we had nothing left to do but sit outside with our friends. So inevitably, we would remember this game every summer called If I Were. And if I were went like this, if I were have my cell phone going on, I do that too. Here's what I would do. And then we'd argue about what we would or wouldn't do. If I was driving down the freeway and my brakes went out, here's what we would do. The one question that would come up every summer was, if I were in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement, here's what I would do. Now, we were kids. We didn't understand the bravado, that we were expressing. Why? We didn't understand what Jim Crow was. We didn't understand the choiceless choices that our parents had to endure. So we were full of ourselves about what we would put up with and what we wouldn't, what we would do and what we wouldn't do. And boy, would we argue about that question. But that question would also haunt me. For most of my life, I would think, what would I have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement? What would I have said? How would I have shown up? Would I have been brave? Would I have been courageous? Then about 5 years ago, I realized I no longer had to wonder. And I'm here to tell you all today, neither do any of you. The truth is this: whatever it is we would have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement is what we will do when we leave this program today. History will judge us. Our children will judge us, and our grandchildren will judge us for the choices we make over the coming years. This is not just a struggle for the young. This is not just a struggle for the liberal. This is not just a struggle for the Jew or the black. This is a struggle for every American who chooses an inclusive America over the politics of exclusion and bigoted violence. This is the moment when our voices get to be heard, where the sound of our feet marching tremble across this nation. This is our moment to move America forward if we choose. But we have to choose to. And we have to choose to do so together. Those of us who are a little bit older, that might include me, should understand that we have a responsibility. We have spent our lives building networks, building experience and knowledge around how to organize. Let us take that power. Let's take the power of our networks and give and feed the movements that are seeking to bridge divides, to deal with the inequality of race and economy in our society. Let us be good hosts in this moment. Let us understand that when people visit us, they shouldn't have to ask for that second glass of water. They shouldn't have to ask for a place to sit down. To be a host of the 21st century civil rights movement means being expansive. It means understanding complexity. It means knowing that this moment will shape the rest of the beginning of this new age. Not many people get a chance to say that they get to shape the beginning of a new period, a new moment. But that's where we all are now. Let's take it seriously. Let's put a smile on our faces. Let's be grateful that God put us here in this moment where we can make a difference. Thank you.
As our Haggadah says, Dainu, if it had only been that, it would have been enough. But we have more. I think what we'll do is take a true 5-minute break to stretch, to move around. I know there are many, many, many people watching online from what my phone is telling me. Leave the stream going. We'll be back in 5 minutes to hear from Rabbi Jonah Pesner, director of the RAC, and have a panel conversation with our speakers that you should be involved with as well.